Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. We're going to be chatting with Rebekah Baze of CIC Consulting Group. Rebekah has been in the industry about 20 plus years, consulting with condominium associations specifically. And she's a wealth of knowledge. She constantly is my go-to for clients. We have purchasing in certain buildings, or if I'm representing a listing and I need to know truly what's going on in a building, she could help with all of that. She does a lot of consults with HOA and board members directly as well, and is just the queen of condos for our area. So looking forward to chatting with her about the cost of condo ownership. We are looking at doing this series once a quarter. So if you have any specific questions you would like us or topics to discuss, feel free to reach out. We'd love to hear from you. All right. Thanks, Rebekah, for joining this morning. I always love just talking with you and nerding out about the condos and, the HOA documents and just gossiping in general.
Same. You're so fun to work with.
Yeah. Like, did you hear this? Did you hear this?
Yes.
And I've always told you, I appreciate your method of looking at all the different condos because they're not apples to apples. When you have a 10-unit building or 40 or a 250 plus, they're completely different, and how they're ran is completely different. And, they're somewhat put in a box with the resale certificate. And also the reserve study, and how buyers are supposed to be looking at what the reserve study is, and even homeowners or even, existing homeowners or board members looking at that study. And it's not fair that all buildings are created the same in that. And so you do a really good job at dissecting like everything about the building, how it's ran, how many units, the history, how it compares to all the other buildings, and no one's really doing that. And so that's why I really do value the service that you provide buyers, me when I have my questions, and I just know that you have, very factual information to be backing up kind of the, your analysis and the information that you're sharing. So I just think you're the condo queen.
Well, thank you. No, and I do find that, the data has helped me with my opinions too. Over the years, I have questions, or in my head, I think something. Building a system the way I built it and doing the same thing every time has helped me identify trends and things and see things differently. So the data side has been really fun to dissect and put together and keep track of.
Yeah, that's great. And you get pretty much rolling. I know you asked me if I have updated resale certificates, and I'm sure you have other agents out there that are kind of keeping you posted on everything. So you're keeping all your information very, very current.
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely. And that's the fun part of doing these reviews now over time is, I looked at this property a couple of years ago. How has it progressed? What's changed? And then plugging all that data in to see those. And those trends are impactful. If 20 buildings are doing X, if 100 buildings are doing the same thing, well, then we should assume maybe that the others should be, or, so that's kind of what a lot of what I try to get to is, what should we be doing? What is normal? What's reasonable? What ends up being successful? And how can we try and dissect that in other communities?
Yeah. Well, today we're here to talk about the cost of condo ownership in general, because we've seen a lot of costs go up for homeowners in the last year. With them wanting to feed their reserves, maybe maintenance projects that were deferred, and just kind of a lot of changes in general. So this is very timely topic. And so I guess we could kind of dive right in with what are the standard increases that you're really seeing with the condo ownership right now?
Yes. Well, we had obviously a unique cycle coming through and out of COVID. Prior to COVID, the general rule of thumb-ish was dues should go up 3 to 5% a year. That was kind of the standard. With COVID, what I see in the data and what I'm seeing come out of it is during COVID, we did a lot of, we don't want to raise the dues because of hardship. So many associations didn't increase assessments, didn't pay more for things. And sometimes that worked out. Maybe we didn't do as much maintenance. Maybe the janitorial services were reduced or not used as much. So some of that was balanced by not increasing dues because we didn't spend quite as much. But what came out of that, of course, post-COVID is all of those material costs increase, inflation. Now, because you didn't do your minimal increase during COVID, now you're exponentially behind, and associations are having to do really large increases to keep up. And I'm seeing that consistently, regardless of the size of community. It's just, that's what's happening.
What is on the highest scale? What is the highest increase you've seen?
Probably insurance. Insurance is the highest, and I've seen assessments go up Some communities, the high ones I've seen, their assessments have gone up 60%. Some have gone up 50%. Yeah, I mean, some have increased significantly. And we'll, in a little bit, I'll show you some of that data. But there have been some really large increases, and then pretty consistently, I would say the lowest increase during 2020 to 2023 budget cycle is about a 10%. That seems to be the very low end. Yep. And those ones are going to run into trouble because 10% isn't enough.
Enough. Yeah. It's funny because when all these increases are happening and, you know, living in a building myself and going through the budget cycle and having all these meetings with your homeowners and people are like, you know, I can't believe dues are going up. And, you know, people don't quite understand all the complexities of what goes into, you know, maintaining a building and all the costs that go into it. And so it's been sticker shock for a lot of them. And you get a lot of opposition from homeowners who aren't really that involved. And they just see, okay, well, my dues are going up 20%. I can't believe it, you know, but in reality, it's something that needs to happen in order to hedge, you know, the risk of special assessment down the line too.
Yes.
So yeah, it's kind
of.
And
I hear that a lot. I hear things like, well, it's too high. And then my standard reply is, well, compared to what?
Yeah.
Some are high, you know, should it be higher compared to what it was 10 years ago? Yes, it is. Compared to the one across the street, maybe it isn't as high as their increase. You know, you may not know that data. So that feeling that yes, assessments are going up and they're really high, it's valid, but without that context, that's where people fall down is they don't understand maybe that every building in the land is doing the same thing. Maybe they don't. And how could they, right? Because you live in your little world of your building and your budget.
Exactly. So are associations generally managing their future responsibility in your eyes? Like they're actually kind of catching on to their role of, are you seeing when you're kind of going through the documents that people are getting smarter and how they're running the buildings and how they're looking for the future in terms of maintenance and all that?
Good question. I do feel coming out of COVID, based on meeting minutes at least, that there is more scrutiny. We have to pay attention more. We have to sit down and figure out what we're going to do. And I do find that this is a pretty consistent kind of human factor where I see it a lot. Say, for example, a building goes through a major repair project. Because of all that effort during that time frame, typically what happens is the 2, 3, 4, or 5 years after that, we do nothing. Nothing happens. And then you get behind. So it kind of depends on where the building is in need. Many associations are paying attention to the future because costs have increased. So there is more interest in planning. They're still running into the same pushback that we can only raise our dues so much over time. So the communities who suffer the most and are struggling the most are the ones who are 20, 30 years old and really far behind. The properties that are 10 or 20 years old, they're just kind of behind. So age has a big part of it. The age of construction is a significant factor when looking at what rate are expenses increasing and how far behind are they.
And so do you have any tips or tricks for those associations looking at managing those costs or expenses? Because I know the reserve study gives that 30-year period in which you go through. Is there anything when you're doing your consults with HOAs, you have them focus on more versus the scary 30-year outlook?
It has to be a short term, well, both. Because the study covers 30 years, you have to look at that picture. You have to plan for that 30-year timeline, because if you don't, at year 25, you're going to be looking at potentially millions of dollars in expenses. We also know that in 5 years, everything can change. In 10 years, everything does change over time. Costs change, everything goes sideways. The reserve study is definitely a key tool, and it's a very, very important tool. Unfortunately, there are a lot of really bad reserve studies out there. And some buildings have suffered because of that. I mean, we've had examples where, and I've put them side by side, where here's this reserve study saying, and a good example off the top of my head was a building where one reserve study says your 30-year projected expenses are 30 million. By the time we got a real reserve study from somebody else, it's actually 50 million. So that community had to do a significant increase to the contribution to catch up. So that's where I try to advise associations to focus on is that contribution level. If the reserve study gives you a baseline, that's the minimum you should put in. And I see many associations funding at half the baseline recommendation. So logically, what do you think is going to happen? That's how it turns out.
Yep. And that kind of rolls over in the next topic. So are special assessments sometimes a good thing?
They are definitely a good thing, because how else do you do it? Yes. And what I also have seen is as the buildings age, it gets harder and harder to accommodate those costs through your regular annual budget. So there's some buildings, there's a couple, towers built in the 70s that need millions of dollars worth of work. You can't increase assessments, then the loan to value ratio is too far off. So many associations have to rely on special assessments. The other good thing about them is when they're in place, they're identified, and that is identified risk that we know about. So we love that. I always tell brokers, if you find a community that is in the middle of or just recently had a special assessment, look closest at those, because they did something, they fixed it, it's over with. We don't have to wonder when that special assessment will show up. So I do see quite a few of those, and I see associations needing to rely on them the older they get. The further behind they get, the older they get, it's just natural. And they're good because they make a correction. That's how you have to make a correction.
Yep. You have to add value to your building too. It's a remodel.
Yes.
Normal, they're living, breathing structures, just as homes, single family homes are too. And what we consider them, you have to put, your energy resources, capital into them to keep them going. So,
and that's something I find interesting, doing these resale certificate reviews of buyers. I talk to all kinds of buyers, first home buyers, single family home retirees now moving to condos. I've owned 10 condo buyers. And consistently, we focus on what might you have to pay for while you live here. That's, of course, the factor. So those special assessment risks are really critical and really important to understand, because we don't want the hot potato. We don't want to catch the one that's got the massive assessment. The ones that just did one, those are the best. You won't get that. On the flip side, we do also pay extra close attention to what did they do with that special assessment? What didn't they do with that special assessment? So what else is left? So sometimes I've seen communities where we just did a full strip and reclad, major, massive special assessment. Great. In 5 years, you need to do another one for the plumbing. So be, careful of that. So they come in cycles and waves of cost. And the special assessment is a good way, a property with one is a good way to help identify where are they in those cost cycles.
Yep. And are you, as far as looking at the different types of properties, so I know we identified kind of the older structures, but location wise, downtown versus, let's say, the suburb condos, or low rises versus high rises, are you seeing, do you see any trends, I guess, with those that need more special assessments than others?
Yeah. Ooh, product. Yes. I try to call it product type. Construction type is a huge factor out in the suburb, and it boils down to age of development. So when was that area developed? Downtown Seattle is very mature. We don't have as many broad, big landscaped areas with multiple buildings that cover a lot of territory, like out in the suburbs. So out in the Bellevue, Redmond, Microsoft area, we've got, many associations that have 10 or 12 buildings and no elevators. And those were primarily developed 70s, 80s. Same thing with Mercer Island. Everything was kind of developed at the same time out there. So that does play a factor, is where, of course, each building is unique. Downtown Redmond, we have newer construction. Suburbia Redmond, we have old construction. Some of those have gone through major rehabs. So now they're brand new, essentially. So it does play into it, the location, more so the product type. What is the type of construction? But there are little pockets of development. Everything in this area was built around the same time. Everything in that area was built around the same time. So you can kind of see those trends when I start digging into data, I can see those trends.
Yep. And so, and I would say probably, a trend between a wood frame building versus, concrete structure, and then the different elements, amenity spaces, all that
Yes.
sort of thing.
Absolutely. Yes. So some of those suburban complexes have a cabana and a pool. Well, that's about the same cost as having an elevator for places that don't have a cabana or a pool over time. So some of it's a wash, but honestly, a big factor with the more suburban areas is just pure square footage. If you've got 100 units in 10 buildings, that's a different cost to paint every 8 to 10 years. And that's become really expensive when it's time to replace all the roofs. That's expensive. What I'm seeing with a lot of those communities is a push to try to offset some of those costs to owners, especially windows. Older communities, if we get to the point where we know we can't pay for a full strip and reclad, let's just delete the windows from the association's responsibility and make owners pay for those separately. And sometimes that's works.
That's okay. I kind of, whenever, and I feel like I've ran into that more often than not in a few of the reviews that you've done actually for me in the past couple months, where that is different. And those are new construction. Actually, they're right out the gate. They're saying that
yes,
you yourself are responsible for your own windows, which I kind of feel is not what we had seen, let's say 10 years ago.
It is not, and it's not ideal in any way, shape, or form from a risk mitigation perspective. I mean, we don't want individual owners calling Joe Window Guy to install the window. And what if they install it upside down and now the whole wall is leaking water? Who pays for that? That's the risk, of course. Good associations would have some form of document package that if you're responsible for your own windows, here's how you must do it. I rarely see that. And up to a certain point, associations built 40 years ago and state law and documents written around that time, we didn't have systemic window failures yet. We hadn't had to do a whole bunch of window replacement projects. So it's lessons learned on the development side, where how do we control costs for the association, put as much as possible on the owners.
Is there any other things like windows that you run across?
Well, insurance has changed significantly.
That's good
cost for not only the cost to insure, but how associations are requiring owners to pay for damage. So at one point, and consistently, older communities, the documents pretty much said, and this is of course summarizing, and it's not all of them, if there's a leak, the association pays for it unless it was somebody's negligence. Now we're seeing significant trend and lots of amendments where, for example, unless somebody was negligent, let's say your unit, not because someone was negligent, has damage, window leak, water leak somewhere that wasn't your responsibility. Now, how associations are dividing that up is saying if it's one unit's damaged, that unit pays for it, regardless of the source. So one of the few ways the association can mitigate some of their expenses is to push those down to owners. And insurance is a huge one. It's coming up everywhere.
Yeah, I've witnessed that too with a couple leaks in our building and other buildings around us too. And then the insurance premiums have if you could talk a little bit about that too, because I think that was a major increase this year, that also contributing factor why dues went up was because of the premiums for the buildings actually went up.
Yes, let me show you. I pulled a few and I tried, I left the building name off just because I wanted to kind of focus on the data. So I'll just talk about them as we go.
Should I guess which one it is?
Yes.
I'm joking.
Well, you can look at the numbers and you might be able to guess. There aren't that many at this level, this is a big one. Yes, let's play the guessing game. So what I pulled was, and I took these charts from my proprietary system that I use when I do a review. So I take every resale certificate and plug it into my charts to be able to illustrate this for buyers and then do things like this. So what I did for these samples was purely look at insurance and the reserve. I covered up the other pieces here, even though, they're still there. I just covered them up. So what I focused on was the overall increase from 2020 to 2023 from the budget. Some budgets don't match what they actually spent. We'll talk, there's all kinds of playing games around that, but this is what they're budgeting. And then in the bottom right is the total increase in assessment during this time period. So for this particular community, Between 2020 and 2023, their insurance cost went up 33%, and they increased their reserve contribution by 47%. That's a huge increase. And their total assessment was almost 20. This one, their insurance went up 89%. This is 2200 Westlake. 89% their insurance cost increased, and they increased electively their reserve contribution by 40. Overall, 25% increase. This one, Cosmopolitan, 91% increase in insurance, 107% increase in their reserve contribution. Some of this was related to having not the best management and resources. Now we make a course correction when we get good management and a good reserve study. 38% increase in assessment. 56 and 51% increases for the Concord. They're a pretty stable building. Over time, they've done a reasonable job of increasing. You can see that reserve contribution portion. During COVID, we only increased 10 grand. Whoops. Wow. Now we have to do some bigger increases. This is a pretty consistent picture. The Ellington, I was glad they accidentally gave me the wrong budget this cycle, because the Master Association carried their insurance expense. I couldn't see exactly what they were paying for insurance in 2020, but just trying to do a little math, roughly 150 grand of that, I'm guessing, was insurance. So theirs went up over 100% cost of insurance, and their reserve contribution, they increased 24 for an overall 30% increase almost.
Wow.
Park Belltown, 81% increase in insurance, 15% increase in the reserve contribution, which isn't that high. But the reason they didn't have to do a higher increase is look at their rate of increase over time. They're doing a 5% increase to contribution, which they've done for a really long time. So they didn't have to do a massive change. I left this chart over here exposed to show how did they keep it at 13.5 instead of 30. Well, we deleted a position. We got rid of $60,000 in a personnel position to manage those costs. Still 13.5%. This one, Ballard Place, they've gone up 53% in insurance, 68% increase in the reserve contribution, 26% overall. Luma, 57% increase in insurance, 38 for reserves, only 11 overall, because they haven't gotten too far behind yet. Even though they're not quite increasing the way they should, they're still pretty young. Avenue One, 25% increase in insurance, 56 in reserves, 9% overall. This was one of the more contained ones I looked at recently. Their insurance went up a lot, but everything else was pretty stable. They didn't have as big of fluctuations.
Gotcha.
Park Grandview is a small community. They manage their cost increases through cell tower revenue. So they only had to, still with their cell tower revenue, almost a 22% increase. And then the smaller one, this is another small one, Masonville, I think, 83% increase in insurance, 15 in reserves, 11 overall. And then the small one, 9 unit, you get to the point where we can't raise dues $1,000 per unit. If our insurance goes up 135%, you've got to do something. So we reduce the reserve contribution and then rely on special assessments to keep that at 8% when we're already a little bit high. So what I found with running those numbers, the average out of all those we looked at, insurance average increase was over 70%, 70.5. And the increase to the reserve contribution for those was 57. That was the average between all of those.
Wow.
I found that to be pretty impactful, that insurance is absolutely significantly increasing. And I would say the majority of properties I'm looking at, the average increase is about 30% from 2020 or even 2021 to this year.
Yep.
Driven by all of those things.
Do you think, and I know this is just pulling this out as a topic of conversation really, but do you think that we will continue to see the same type of increases next year? And I know we're kind of moving in, this fall will be budget season. So I think we'll start seeing a few more kind of proposed budgets for 2024 out there to see what the trends are. And either it's going to say we're going to see consistent numbers increasing, or maybe we'll see some tapering off, because this may have been the correction year, right, from COVID.
I think 22 and 23 are definitely correction years. Yes. I believe 2024 will see continued increases because insurance is going to continue to skyrocket. And not only that, everything's getting a year older. So every building that was built 20 years ago is now 21 years old and higher risk and more failures and more need to do work that we can't afford.
Yep.
So I do believe that the need to increase reserve contributions to pay for the increased cost should drive assessments for another couple of years at a higher rate than 3 to 5%. Whether they do it or not, they should, from what I'm seeing.
Yep.
And a lot of it is because they're behind. So newer buildings haven't gotten too far behind. Their cost increases may be a little more controlled, although at the same time, new buildings take a while to stabilize. We don't know what it might cost once we figure out, get through construction defect litigation like Luma and Insignia. They're getting close. Then we'll know what it's going to cost, and then we'll see what it really takes. Until then, we don't know. But the buildings that are from new construction, once they hit about year 6 or 8, now with COVID, when they hit about year 8, they start to stabilize. So those maybe shouldn't see as significant increases. The older ones, I would assume would or should.
Yep.
And if they aren't increasing by 30%, then that just means it's a higher risk of special assessment.
Later down the road. Yeah.
Got
it. Do you want to talk a little bit about Kiowa, the 2018 changes?
Yes, from a cost perspective, absolutely. One thing I believe will roll out of Kiowa is new construction, and specifically just to talk about a couple towers, right? So we haven't had a ton of new construction outside of, DADU, ADU condos, some small development townhomes, but our new towers, Spire, Insignia, Nexus, under Kiowa, they won't have the same potential for recovery from construction defect claims the way older buildings did under that Condo Act. So what I believe will happen is they'll get some form of settlement for whatever they negotiate through that construction defect, but they won't have that deferred revenue to draw from in the future. So I predict, maybe I shouldn't, I expect, I assume maybe what will happen is we'll see the new construction condos increase at a very different rate than they have in the past.
So higher, you think?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. One, they're more technical, they're more fancy, they're all very different than
amenity driven.
Yes, very much amenity driven. Like, for example, the Emerald got a new reserve study, and they're looking at within 10 years adding $5 million in expenses to renovate the amenities. Others don't even have that in the reserve study. So that will drive expenses, I think, very differently under Kiowa, because they won't get the recovery the same way they did under the Condo Act. Yeah. And that deferred revenue is what has helped buildings like Olive 8. They've stayed incredibly healthy for a long time. Bellevue Towers, same thing. They're sitting on a ton of deferred revenue from their settlement. So they haven't had to increase those assessments the same way. I think coming out of this new construction cycle and going into Kiowa, we'll see that change. I think we'll see assessments go up differently.
Yeah, or be, I guess, structured differently out of the gate too, maybe because the new norm is that everything is going to be definitely over $1 a square foot. And I guess that's a good question too. What are you seeing as kind of the average per square foot for, let's say, downtown? I know it ranges differently than where you're at.
Yeah, and that's fun. It's so funny. Brokers track everything square foot. I kind of look at average per unit, because square foot per building isn't necessarily the same. Yep, that's true. And I'll just give you a quick look, is looking at average assessment for the building. So going through some of the data, I focus on average assessment per unit for the building, just as a way to try to compare properties as opposed to square footage. So for example, a Scala is at about $1,400 average per unit. If we take number of units divided by the budget equally. 200 Westlake's about $1,232. New ones start out 188, starts out low. We know that'll end up here. So what I found in playing around with this data, of course, is seeing it change over time. First time I looked at Insignia, the average was, closer to 8 or 9. Now we're at 1150 average.
Yep.
Where I'm playing around with this is looking at what is the median for assessments out in the world, just for any condo. The first time I started playing with that data, it was about 480. Now I'm at about 530. So about $530 a month is median, which is everything from towers down to 4-unit condos.
Yeah.
So buyers' perceptions about cost, $6,000 a year is your minimum baseline just to pay the bills for your most basic type of condos, essentially, is how that should be perceived. And then the more technical and complex and new
and larger,
double it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And location, right?
Location, yeah. Yeah.
So I'm thinking for towers, you should be in the $1,000 to $1,500 a month should be a norm. That should be a reasonable expectation. And then going downward from there, at a minimum, I would hope that associations are at about $500 a month.
Mm-hmm.
That would be healthy-ish.
Yeah. And then I guess our world, how we look at it, I think that does come out to probably, 80 cents to $1.10 a square foot.
Okay.
Yeah. That's kind of where I saw last year's numbers. Now this year it'll be interesting as the budget cycle approaches, how that increases. And then also the new construction, because they always maintain, very lower HOAs with a couple anomalies out there, but it'll be interesting to see, like you said, how the new buildings approach Kiowa and I guess increasing their costs right out the gate.
And I'm seeing, looking at the three, Insignia, Spire, and the Emerald, they're good comps because they're all fairly same era, pretty close to each other. They have 3 different reserve study providers. So each of those have a very different perspective about what's on the list for that reserve study to fund for. So I find that once the developer goes away and once we do a transition and once we settle, then we get the real reserve study. And that's when you see a spike, because now we have everything on the list instead of just some of what should be on the list.
Yep. I'm going to throw another random question at you.
Okay.
With the reserve studies, the companies that do prepare them, what is the certification process, or what do you have? What makes you able to actually provide the resale certificate, or the reserve studies to these buildings?
You have to be a reserve study professional. Okay. Which is a designation that is, I believe it's through CAI. I'm not sure if there's a reserve study professional group, but there's some level of certification. So the state law says you have to get, and this applies to every association in the state. Unless you're exempt, which is very few should be exempt, even though they pretend they're exempt. It's if you have nominal reserve costs would exempt you from the requirement to get a reserve study every year. It used to be a certain number of units. It's changing frequently. So the state law says you're required to do an on-site study every 3 years from a reserve study professional and an update in between. So you could do your own update. The key would be having a reserve study professional do one reserve study every 3 years, which isn't the best law. And of course, the law says there's no penalty if you don't follow the reserve study law. So reserve study professional ideally does one reserve study. And then if you have the technical capacity, some associations out there do manage their reserve expenses differently than having the reserve study provider come out every year. But that is an option. So once a year or once every 3 years from a designated reserve professional who has the stamp, who's been authorized as such, and then they don't have to, and then you can do your own update if you want to in between.
And so are there like 10 groups out there? Are there 20? Like how many?
There's probably 20 or 30.
Okay.
A few of them have fallen off, but there's a few main ones that do most of them.
And there's general guidelines in the way that they have to actually conduct their reserve study. It's just that it's up to them when they come up with the numbers on what things are going to cost of inflation, numbers moving forward. Everyone has their own opinion and own metrics to that. Is that correct?
Yes. And some reserve analysts say, for example, add things like contingencies or allowances. So they know, for example, that if the building is 30 years old, let's add every 5 years, let's put in 20 grand for plumbing repairs. Not all reserve analysts do that. Gotcha. There's only 1 or 2 out there that actually factor in sales tax into the cost. So they're 10% more correct than the rest. So that does play into a big factor when we talk about the reserve study funding, is if you're funding at baseline, you're 10% low because you're not even including sales tax. So that you can see that coming when I like looking at my charts and looking at that data and the historic funding levels, like, well, no wonder you get behind. And of course, those reserve studies are very impactful if they're very thorough or not. If you're looking at a tower and you go to the component list in a reserve study and it's 1 page long, you should maybe be concerned.
Yeah.
And then you look at the next one and they have 4 pages of components that they're funding for. Yeah, you're probably missing a few things. And I did see that recently. Insignia, who did a major increase to their reserve contribution, discovered that something wasn't in the last study. Well, when you add it, you're adding millions of dollars in future costs. Now you have to increase to get there. So that's a big factor, is we didn't have it on the list. We didn't know we should have, or something unusual happened. And that drives a lot of special assessments. Another big factor was coming out of COVID, everybody downtown in Seattle did a ton of security upgrades, tons of them. It was very costly. None of that was factored into the reserve study. None of it was factored into a budget. Now you're behind. Now we have to catch up. So I see that continuing from a few angles. The other angle would be statutory. So when the state decides, here's a new law you all have to comply with. And a good example of that is in California, where now they're required to do balcony inspections because the Berkeley balconies collapsed and killed people. So every building in California has to do certain inspections, make certain repairs, fill out there's a cost that new. EV charging stations in Washington state. Now we have to allow it. Now we're playing around with how do we pay for that? Can we even allow it? What if we decide we can't have natural gas anymore? Special assessment. What if? So the legislation and statutory obligations may have a huge impact, because every time we've seen those state laws change, there's cost.
And I know with the gas, it's funny you said that, because I know that we, that's something that we're definitely approaching in downtown Seattle too. And I don't know if you have any information to share in that regard, but no new construction with gas allowed. And then they've been talking about the older structures that have gas, taking that away in the future, which is going to be just insane. Not reality, but
no. And the buildings weren't constructed to accommodate the level of electricity that may be needed if you remove the other source of utility.
The capacity to put the systems.
Exactly.
Right?
Yep. Recently I was reading, was it Olive 8? They did an EV charging project, I think a couple of years ago, sent a big survey out to owners. Who wants to participate? Those owners paid. And I think there were 30, quite a few. They each paid $5 or $6 grand. Well, now we're at the point where they can't do anymore. That was the ability at the time. And sorry, everybody, you had your chance. We physically can't, without a significant cost, add the infrastructure to accommodate. So statutory impact can be significant. And I think we'll see that with Wakaiowa. The state law changed. It's going to have a cost impact.
This is just a reminder of, the building in which you're looking at living in, purchasing in, or you're living in currently. It's really important to have board members and people that are involved who are very invested in getting to know the process and complexities of all these things on the financial side, the reserve study. And I know are a great resource. And, I think for board members that are our committee members, reaching out to professionals to get, like yourself, to get kind of a breakdown of the things that they should be looking for. Because I think the reserve study is a huge one that I think, you get a study from a professional company and you think that this is it, and this is what you should be budgeting for. And nothing different, because, you're not a professional board member, which I think we talked about that before, right? So is that,
and unless you've read hundreds of documents, how do you know how they're different from each other, or what's missing, or what is wrong? And before we go, let me show you one more quick.
And I do want to touch on, because I think before we hopped on, you mentioned something about boards now allowing for professional management. So we'll sidetrack to that too.
Yeah. I wanted to show a couple charts of a review I did that the buyer was really hesitant to get under contract because the dues were really high. compared to other properties. This was about a 40 unit higher end, $1 million units, I think Kirkland, but the picture of their budget was very different from many. And what struck me and what jumped out was they're putting 48% of their budget to reserves. So when you talk about the elective portion of the budget, that's the reserve contribution. You can't choose your insurance. You can't choose, you can sort of choose. You could delete your earthquake coverage. You could reduce the valuation. You could increase the deductible. But the reserve contribution, you can definitely choose. So this community had only done about a 15% increase, but their reserve contribution was incredibly high, which was making the dues high. Partly because they were funding at a reasonable level compared to the reserve study's recommendations. They were above baseline, not quite at full funding, and their cash flow projection was showing why they were funding at that high level, which was to plan and prepare for the 2, 4, 6, 7, or 8 million in expenses that was coming in 20 years. So this buyer is buying into a community where for the first 10 or 20 years, you're looking at very low risk in preparation for down the road, as opposed to many I see where we go upside down in 10 years because we're putting 20% of the budget to reserves. So that high dues amount for this buyer, once we got through it, illustrated lower special assessment risk in the future.
Yep.
So that was a really good example. And the key there was half of their budget almost is going to the reserve account. Yep. I would say if an association, not towers, although they're getting there. Towers, it's more 15 to 20%. Baseline for everybody else should be a minimum of 25% of your budget should be going to the reserve account. If you're not, you may be heading for some trouble.
That's a good way of looking at it too. Because, we do receive feedback from buyers out there in buildings, are ran very well, responsibly, and have kind of that low risk, and buyers are coming, wow, the HOA dues are just so high. And so it's good to be able to say, well, this is the reason why. Right. And it's actually a good thing. It's not a bad thing, or there's no, bad intent in that. It's actually just planning.
It's not wasteful. It's not frivolous.
No,
there's,
going in
it's not, I mean, board associations very rarely assess more than they should. It's highly unusual. And if they do, it's an accident. Whoops.
Yeah, I think Kat just put in there, what is a good percentage that should be contributed? And you said 25% is
baseline. Yep.
Baseline.
Yeah. And of course there's variables there. If you just did a full strip and reclad and a large special assessment, maybe 10 to 15 is okay until you add something back on the list. If you just did a full strip and reclad, plumbing, elevators, and roof, well, now you've got 50 years. So you can start lower again and reset that clock. So it all depends on what haven't you done? Where are you at today? And can you increase it more? But I would say 25% should be a baseline. And I'm seeing a lot of towers hitting that 25%. Cosmo, Concord, Escala's at close to 25, which also speaks to if we're seeing towers and communities end up in that 20 to 25 range, but yet we start at 10 and keep it at 10 for a few years, that's why you get to 25. Those early years exponentially impact the long term.
Yeah. Good.
Wakiowa, so the board members. So something unusual about Wakiowa, well, it's changed. I guess it's not unusual. It is what it is. Not all owners are required, not all board members are required to be owners in the community. So I did a review recently for a new construction project, and there was a lot of language in the documents about how you could essentially hire board members to run your association. So thinking about cost, that could be a cost impact, but that could maybe result in better managed communities. If we remove that emotional connection, if you remove that impact of the board member, the board president doesn't want everybody to hate them if they raise dues by 10%. So it opens the door for some different layer of governance and management for associations. So I think we'll see how that turns out, if that becomes impactful or not. Yep.
I feel like that would be very impactful, because even if you had one person on a board that could offer more professional advice as far as structuring, how do you look at certain things, and provide a different voice versus everyone sitting in a room and talking, over each other, or not, not knowing what they're talking about in the first place, just
With no
guessing.
context.
With no context, doing their own research and talking to who, I could see that adding a lot of value. It would cost a little upfront to have that, but definitely would add a lot of value in the end.
And it would be good. So, the management companies, we want them to manage our community. Well, their job is to collect, what they should be doing is collect the payments, produce the financials, and advise the board.
Mhm.
Well, of course, we've got volunteer board members, and how do there's so many disconnects there in expecting the management company to govern.
And tension points, basically. So what
Exactly.
basically what that happens is you get the tension between the management company and what their role is, or what, or additions to their role that they're not supposed to actually be stepping into. And then you have the board, and they just kind of end up clashing sometimes. So,
and lacking skill set. Absolutely. Management companies have no requirements for certification, or, there's no obligation to be anything.
Mhm.
And, I think it's the worst job in all the land. It's like, there's no way people calling all day, every day about all, but it's a tough job. But I'm hoping Wakiowa will, I want to say remove, so it's just adding burden. There's more requirements. There's more that, the record keeping requirement now has overridden state law, or every association. So Wakiowa's record keeping requirements now apply to every association in the state, which, it's like putting up more signs to stop speeding.
Yeah,
Great,
which was exempt before for smaller. What was the exemption before then for record keeping?
It was just different. Like
Yeah,
it wasn't necessarily exemption. It's just not the long list. So Wakiowa is now, you have to keep 7 years of data, a history of this or that. And yes, that's supposed to be helpful. What I see in documents frequently is turnover with management companies and that cost. So we just switch and trade. And we see that a lot, where I did one the other day and they'd gone through, I had history on them for, 10 or 12 years. And they're back to hiring the same management company they fired 12 years ago, because all that board's gone and the new board's, so there's that cycle. And that's costly. Every time you change management companies, you lose institutional knowledge. You can't find financials. Nobody has history. But even the older governing documents have significant language about record keeping requirements. Nobody did it. So now we have a new state law, but now we'll really do it.
Yeah. Well, now we really
won't. We won't.
Good. All right. Well, I think we covered a lot, and I think we should do another one of these and just talk about management and maybe the internals. Or if anyone who sees this has a topic that they would like us to cover, maybe we'll do one of these once a quarter and just kind of check in.
Yeah, I like it.
Sweet. All right. Well, thank you. You're always a wealth of knowledge, and all of our contact information will be out there, so you could feel free to reach out if there's any other follow-up questions.
Thanks for having me, Ashley. Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure.